Link's Awakening is one of the most beloved games in the Zelda franchise, and the first in the series to be released for a handheld console. But as a result of that fact, the original game was severely limited in its presentation. The Game Boy's LCD display could only show the game's graphics in monochrome, which essentially meant that the game could only be viewed in varying shades of green on its original hardware. Because of these limitations, many fans of the original were excited to see a full-color release for the new Game Boy Color in 1998. This new director's cut of the game, as it was called, finally added the vivid colors to Koholint that were so sorely missed in the original title. But at a cost that is not usually discussed by fans of the game. Because so many of these issues go overlooked, I wanted to compile my problems with the director's cut, and explain why I think they lessen the overall quality of the game, beginning with a quick history of the original title's development. The development of Link's Awakening was, perhaps quite fittingly, strange from the start. It began not as an official project by Nintendo, but as a pet project of Kazuaki Morita and Takashi Tezuka, the latter of which would go on to become the director of the game following its official approval by Shigeru Miyamoto. The game's development was free from many of the constraints put on the mainline products from the series both before and after this point. There would be no Zelda, no Triforce, and no mountains of dialogue detailing the history of the game world. This last point is quite vital to understanding the unique appeal of Link's Awakening. Most other games in the Zelda franchise take the bold yet ultimately flawed approach of attempting to teach the player fictional history lessons regarding the world of Hyrule and its mythology. This approach to storytelling ultimately fails because, unfortunately, Zelda and history go together about as well as toothpaste and orange juice. But Link's Awakening was different. It did none of that. In fact, it seemed to mock the overbearing history lessons of previous titles like A Link to the Past, by making its game world take place entirely within the dream of a fish, therefore making the history of the game world entirely inconsequential from the start. Such a premise could have easily spelled disaster, had the writers not understood what they were doing. But they did. The team behind Link's Awakening embraced all of their weird, creative ideas, taking influence from contemporary stories involving dream worlds like Twin Peaks, and created something truly special. The result was a game where you make friends with talking animals, fight Mario enemies, and ultimately are destined to destroy the world, rather than save it. The story of Link's Awakening has such a profound impact on those who play it, so it's no surprise that it garnered such a large following of fans who wanted nothing more than to see the game they loved so much be remade in full color. Unfortunately, that was not the only change made to Link's Awakening. The director's cut also took several liberties with the game, meddling with mechanics and rebalancing the game's difficulty in a way that, I believe, ultimately marred the original game's vision. So let's talk about some of those changes, and why they ultimately hurt the quality of this remake. One of the lesser-known changes to the game involved the stone slabs, now called owl statues. In the original game, each dungeon had a single hint block that could be read once the player found a stone tablet. This one hint would always be a single, vital piece of information that was extremely difficult to figure out without it. For example, the second dungeon, Bottle Grotto, gives the player instructions on what order to kill a group of enemies in, so that he can make a chest containing the Nightmare Key appear. This might seem overbearing at first, but there was actually no way of figuring this out without either getting lucky or finding the stone tablet. The act of acquiring it and fitting it into the stone slab was the only way to know what order these foes had to be killed in. In other words, finding the stone tablet was, in itself, the challenge of this puzzle. Similarly, in the fifth dungeon, the stone slab's hint tells the player to dive underwater where torch beams cross, which is, again, an entirely fair thing to hint at, given that this is the one and only underwater secret that requires diving in the whole game. In other words, the stone tablets provide the answers to only the most difficult of riddles, with no other way to figure them out, and then provide nothing further. Thus, they are balanced, integral parts of the original game's dungeon design. The director's cut took this concept and dumbed it down beyond belief. No longer do stone tablets provide but a single answer to the dungeon's most compelling quandaries. Now, these new owl statues provide the simplest of tutorial guides to each and every player, even spoiling the answer to simple puzzles. Take Bottle Grotto, for instance. As I mentioned previously, the original stone slab gave the player information in regards to a specific order in which enemies needed to be killed to solve a puzzle. This was fair, as there would otherwise be no way of figuring this out beyond trial and error. In the director's cut, by contrast, the very first owl statue now tells players to hit a switch to make fences go up and down. We didn't need this. The tutorial was in the obvious placement of the switch in the center of the room, as well as the fact that it's impossible to advance without first hitting it. There was already a natural, subtle tutorial in place here that taught new players how switches worked. So why did we need a stupid owl statue telling the player exactly what to do? In the very same dungeon, there is another owl statue that tells the player to, quote, make every block design the same, giving away the answer to the block puzzle in the very same room where the owl statue is located. Again, does a player really need to be given such a blatant hint? The answer was already clear, and block pushing was already taught to the player in the previous dungeon, so he knows he can push blocks to solve puzzles already. What was the point of making it more obvious than it already was? These owl statues continuously serve to mar the already brilliant design of Link's Awakening's dungeons, and give absolutely nothing in return. Yet, they are still only the first and most minor of all the changes in the director's cut. The next two changes relate to one another, in that they both have to do with difficulty balancing in several of the game's dungeons. The first of these regards enemy design. Changes were made to some enemies to make them more easy to kill than in the original game. The most egregious of all these changes was made to the boss of Bottle Grotto, Genie. I already had my problems with this fight in the original. The boss openly taunts the player with his own weakness, after all, so this wasn't the greatest fight in the game by any stretch. That being said, Genie's actual attack pattern was pretty damn tough to figure out the first time around, and I'll admit he still kills me every so often on my replays of this game. He shoots fireballs off in rapid succession, which are extremely difficult to outrun if you haven't memorized how he throws them, which no player will the first time they fight him. But in the director's cut, this is no longer the case, because Genie's difficulty was absolutely nuked. Let me give you a demonstration. Here's Genie's fireball attack in the original game. And now, here's the attack pattern in the director's cut. The frequency and speed of the Genie's attack pattern has been utterly destroyed by the remake, turning what was once a formidable boss into a complete chump. I suppose Tezuka saw the original Genie fight and thought it was too hard, but was it? As I said, the boss already shouts out his weakness at the beginning of the fight, and Link's Awakening provides teleporters in order to give players easy access to the boss room, which allows the player to easily retry this fight over and over again. Did we really need to dumb down the enemy design as well? And while we're talking about changes the game did make to boss fights, let's talk about a change it didn't make. Anglerfish is often considered the worst boss fight in the entire Zelda series, because he literally doesn't attack the player in any way during his fight, while simultaneously being killed in just a few lousy hits. Somehow, Tezuka saw this fight and thought it was still totally fine, and made no changes to it in the slightest. I guess he thought the game was somehow too hard, and shouldn't be made any more difficult than it already was. But I don't think anyone was asking for a hell march here. Just an attack pattern would be more than enough to justify this boss. As it stands, he's still the worst boss fight in the entire series. Enemy design is not the only rebalancing issue either. In the original game, there were no potions like in the previous titles, but there was a healing item in the form of Crazy Tracy's special medicine, which the player could buy at her hut out in the woods. The medicine would act upon death, recovering the player's health like the fairies from A Link to the Past. This served as a safety net of sorts, but it was a one-time item and could only be acquired from Tracy. If the player didn't bring some with him, or he already used it up, he would have no way of getting more inside of a level without leaving the dungeon itself. This made the medicine both powerful and rare, which kept it balanced. Unfortunately, this balance is marred in the director's cut, because for some reason, Tracy's secret medicine is now suddenly tucked away in several locations in the game's final 3 dungeons, allowing the player to restock on healing items within the dungeons themselves. This completely kills the challenge of the last 3 dungeons of the game, and turns the brilliant difficulty curve of the original title into a flatline by the end, a flatline that was only exacerbated by the director's cut's new dungeon. This was one of the biggest changes. The Color Dungeon added a brand new level to what was previously an empty part of the map, the Graveyard. This new dungeon is available to do from the moment the player first acquires the power bracelet, right after the second dungeon. This is a problem because the Color Dungeon grants the player an immensely powerful item at its completion, the red or blue tunic. By choosing the blue one, the player will receive only half damage for the rest of the game, essentially doubling the limited pool of health the player had from its measly 14 hearts at max to a now whopping 28. Suddenly, the player goes from having the least amount of endgame health in the entire series to reaching Breath of the Wild levels instead. As you might imagine, this destroys the balancing quite easily, since the game was designed around the player having an incredibly tiny pool of health in the original. Most enemies only do a single heart or half heart of damage, and that includes the final boss even. And combine that with the now easy to find special medicine in the latter dungeons, and suddenly, the player's mistake allowance quadruples from its measly 14 to a whopping 52. How are any of these bosses, many of whom have already been nerfed, supposed to present any challenge to the player at this point? And somehow, the blue tunic isn't even the worst offender in this regard. The red tunic doubles the player's damage output, which, when combined with the covalent sword, allows the player to kill several of the game's bosses with only a couple swipes of the sword. There's one boss in particular who gets hit harder by this power-up than all the others, the Evil Eagle. In the original game, this was one of the most well-designed boss fights in the entire series. The eagle will fly around, swooping down at the player until Link strikes him thrice, and then he switches to his second phase. Here, the eagle will not only dive bomb the player, but will also employ wind attacks that can knock the player off the tower, forcing him to restart the fight. I've been showing you sped up footage of my fight against him in the original game just to make that point clear. It's a long, dynamic, and engaging fight, and it's easily one of the most well designed in the original game. I'm now going to show you the entirety of my fight with the Evil Eagle in the director's cut. This is not how the fight was scripted to happen. The Evil Eagle, as I mentioned previously, is supposed to have two phases, one where he dives at the player, and a second one where he employs a wide range of attacks. In the original game, he was scripted to shift into this second phase after getting hit 3 times, at which point his health would reset. From there, it would take another 6 hits from the covalent sword, 7 with the bow, or 8 with the hookshot to kill the eagle. So why does the eagle not switch to his second phase anymore? Well, with the covalent sword and red tunic equipped, the player now deals enough damage to kill the eagle before his health can reset for the second phase of the fight, which ends the battle before it even really begins. This is a bug that is now exclusive to the director's cut, and ruins what was otherwise one of the 2D game's best boss fights. And all of this because the devs decided to add in a broken set of colored gear to help advertise the game. Perhaps this all could easily have been fixed if the developers had simply made the Color Dungeon an endgame reward, something the player could only clear near the very end of the game, where the bosses are much harder. But then again, the design of the dungeon itself is so lazy and juvenile that it wouldn't really fit anywhere other than at the beginning of the game. Seriously, the main conceit of this dungeon is matching colors together, hitting switches of colors, putting balls of colors into their correct color slots, and killing enemies who hide in colors. Honestly, it feels like something you designed for a kindergartner. To make this the dungeon that holds the game's most powerful endgame gear, and to have it available practically from the start of the game, makes the Color Dungeon the worst addition to a Zelda remake I think I've ever seen. And yet, it's only the second worst change that was made to this remake. One of the biggest problems with the original Link's Awakening was the incessant text boxes that would pop up anytime the player touched any interactable object in the game world. And I do mean any interactable object. Pots, rocks, crystals, doors, anytime you didn't have the correct item equipped to interact with an object, or even sometimes when you did, the game would still decide to remind the player what an object was and why he couldn't move or destroy it. There was at least one saving grace to the game that managed to mitigate this issue: the ability to skip over dialogue by pressing the B button. I would say that about 95% of the dialogue in this game, including the repetitive text, was skippable due to this one feature. This was an immense help, and managed to keep the game from getting entirely bogged down by text. But even so, if there was any one problem with the original game that needed to be fixed in a potential remake, it was the repetitive text. Not only did the director's cut fail to do just that, but it actually decided to make the problem even worse, adding even more text, and then, for some unholy reason, removing the ability to skip over dialogue entirely. Why on earth would anyone at Nintendo think that a player would want to no longer have the option to skip over text? This is a huge problem, because the game becomes immeasurably drawn out when the player can no longer easily skip over all the little bits of repetitive text that appear over the course of the game. It's such a big problem that I've seen it listed as a negative aspect of the game in nearly every Link's Awakening review I've ever seen, because most people who review Link's Awakening have only ever played the director's cut, and therefore think that this is a problem with the base game too. But it's not. Somehow, Tezuka came to regret allowing players to skip over dialogue, and decided to remove the option entirely in the director's cut. I can't, for the life of me, understand the reason why, because this is probably the biggest problem I have with the director's cut of the game, and why I can't stand playing it compared to the original. No amount of pretty colors or Game Boy printer compatibility is going to change that fact, and I can't imagine many others who've played both of these games feel any differently. Obviously, the director's cut was not all bad. As I already said, the addition of color is wonderful, and makes the original graphics pop in a way that simply isn't possible with black and white visuals. And of course, there are some positive bug fixes as well. The magic mushroom now regrows like it was supposed to. Collecting magic powder from the shop at the beginning of the game no longer stops the witch from making some for the player, and Terran is now actually in his house when Marin says he is. But even with those positive changes, the cons are too great for me to ignore, and ultimately mar the original vision of the game. I'm sure there are many who played the director's cut who never would have played the original due to the lack of colors, and that's great. Not everyone can stomach staring at an old piece of crap LCD Game Boy screen the way I can, and I'm sure there are even some out there who would claim they loved the color dungeon and what it added to the game. I'm less sure that anyone got something out of the Game Boy printer functionality, but if even one person did, then I'm glad it was added, because it's otherwise inoffensive. But ultimately, the balancing and quality of life issues of the director's cut are too much of a downgrade for me to handle. When I was making my Link's Awakening review, I'd originally planned to use footage from the director's cut, even though I was reviewing the original, simply to make the video look better for the viewer. But ultimately, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I got to the genie fight at the end of Bottle Grotto and was so disillusioned with how marred the dungeon and enemy design was that I quit the game right there and decided to record the original cartridge instead, monochromatic visuals and all, because ultimately, these are two different games that provide two completely different experiences. The Switch remake goes even farther with changes, and is even further from the original game's vision than the director's cut, albeit for completely different reasons. I'm sure most people who come back to play Link's Awakening will continue to choose between the Switch port or the director's cut, and they'll likely enjoy both of those versions of the game. Link's Awakening, after all, is such an incredible game that even a crappy version of it is better than most other Zelda games out there. Still, to me and many others, the original Link's Awakening will continue to be the definitive way to enjoy this beautiful, wacky little Game Boy game.